like to take you to a dam in Maharashtra and its contested waters. Let me share my screen before that. So growing up in India, I'm sure most of you have heard about Narmada Bachao Andolan. If not that, then you have heard about some other protest where farmers stood up against their government and asked for their water rights. They asked that their water should not be sent to cities and industries. But what if? What if I tell you that building dams in rural areas to grab rural waters is an old style of grabbing rural waters? What if I tell you that some states, like Maharashtra, have figured out more sophisticated ways of grabbing rural water? And that way of grabbing rural water is called water reallocation. So what is water reallocation? Imagine a dam that was proposed as an irrigation dam, purely as an irrigation dam. And after it is built, some of its water is reallocated for other water purposes, say industrial water and domestic water. That's one kind of water reallocation. Another kind of water reallocation is when, let's say, a dam is built with the purpose of providing water for three uses: industrial, irrigation, and domestic. And let's say the water was divided equally, 1/3 each. But after the dam is built, after the funds are secured, or some other life cycle stage of the dam, you realize that the government now wants to reallocate the water in a different way, such that irrigation water is a very small sliver of this total water reallocation. This is another way of reallocating water. How is water reallocation carried out? There are two ways. One is a voluntary negotiation between the buyer and the seller. Let's say I'm a local government, a city government, and I decide that I want water from some rural area. So I will go and ask the owner of that rural water. If it's groundwater, then maybe the farmers or the municipality. And if it's surface water like dam, then maybe the owner of the dam. And then I tell them that, listen, I need some water. You probably don't need it. If you want to give it away, let's have a clear contract. Now that would be voluntary negotiation. Another way of reallocating water is unilateral administrative decision, where the government, without asking the farmers, may redirect the water from the irrigation dam to either cities or industries. Now, I'm sure most of you must have guessed by now that I'm not talking about voluntary negotiations here. Otherwise, I wouldn't call it unjust waters. In the case of Surya Dam, this is exactly what happened. It was a unilateral decision taken by the state of Maharashtra, where Surya's irrigation water was reallocated. It was reallocated to metropolitan Mumbai and many other places, but one of the largest beneficiaries was metropolitan Mumbai. Surya Dam was proposed in 1974. It was built between 1975 and 1990. Two reservoirs and canals were built during this period. Let's try and understand, where does it sit? Surya sits in Maharashtra. To be specific, this is Mumbai. And metropolitan Mumbai covers some parts of the Speechish area and some parts of this red area. The red area is Palghar district, and that's where Surya Dam sits. Over 3 decades and 17 reallocations, we saw that the irrigation water kept on reducing, and more water were redirected towards non-irrigation purposes. How did this happen? To understand that, we need to understand what is metropolitan Mumbai and what is something else, which is Mumbai hydrometric area. This dark gray bold line encompasses metropolitan Mumbai. It has various districts and municipal governments within it. Vasai Virar and Mira Bhayandar are the two local governments that have benefited from Surya's water. Surya flows through Vaitarna Basin, and it meets Vaitarna River and then empties itself in Arabian Sea. We have Dhamni Reservoir here at the top, then Karas Reservoir here. The gray patches that you see are Surya's irrigation command area, which means that these gray patches are where the villages that benefit from Surya's irrigation water sit. Now, if you see something interesting in this map is that Mumbai metropolitan area is here, and there's something called Mumbai hydrometric area, which is twice its size. This Mumbai hydrometric area holds 4 water basins: Vaitarna, Ulhas, Patal Ganga, and Amba. And all of this is in a way demarcated to supply water to Mumbai. Does metropolitan Mumbai own lands in these areas? Does it own the whole of the Mumbai hydrometric area? No. Does it own its water? No. But whenever it needs it, it finds it very easy to go through the government bureaucracy and find ways to build dams in this area. To give you an example, there are 27 dams in this Mumbai hydrometric area that serve metropolitan Mumbai. And of these, about 24 are dams that are partially or completely owned by local governments in metropolitan Mumbai. So why does this happen? The first time Mumbai decided to go out of its jurisdictional boundaries and build a dam was in 1850, when it proposed Bihar Lake. It was finally built in 1860. At that point, Mumbai was only a small portion of the metropolitan area, only this small tip here. And at that point, when Bihar was built outside Mumbai's jurisdiction, probably Mumbai realized that there is no stopping. We can go far beyond in the rural areas and keep on building dams. So as the population increased, more and more dams were proposed, deeper into the rural areas, far beyond Mumbai's jurisdiction. As you can see, Tulsi Dam is farther away from Bihar Dam, which was built in 1880. Then there is Tansa Dam, built between 1892 and 1945. It's much deeper into the rural areas. You see Vaitarna, 1954. Upper Vaitarna, 1973. There is no end to it. On the right, you see a diagram that shows that as the population increases, we also see more and more dams being built. And there's a reason for that. In my archival research, I came across 2 reports, one from 1947, another from 1948, both written by a famous municipal engineer called N.V. Modak. What Modak proposed is that the riparian rights of people in this area are weak. And already there are some dams that exist in this water basin in Vaitarna. So why not build more dams? It makes economic sense, and it's also easier to obtain land in this area. Not only that, it's not just that when the population increases, the government makes more dams. That's just the rationale they present in newspapers. N.V. Modak's report shows that he proposed to expand Mumbai's jurisdictional limits, to urbanize more of Mumbai, to take in surrounding areas within the city, to also industrialize the surrounding areas of Mumbai. And all of this was predicated on grabbing more rural waters, making more arrangements for dams. So what comes first, population explosion or proposal for expansion that leads to population explosion, which leads to the need to build more dams? At this point, I should clarify that the disparities in water allocation is not just an urban-rural issue. Even within urban areas, there is a lot of disparity. Most of the water ends up reaching formal settlements, not informal settlements. In informal settlements, people rely on private vendors, water tankers, sometimes even illegal means of obtaining water. And even within formal settlements, there is a lot of disparity. The government allocates more water to metropolitan areas. So somewhere around 240 to 252 liters per person per day. Whereas small towns might get just 150 and rural areas will get just 70. And all of this, even though the prescribed quantity for metropolitan areas is 150 to 200. So in a way, some of these metropolitan areas get as much water as one would get in a developed country. And all of this is just for long showers, flush tanks, gardens, and many other uses that may not be considered necessary. So why is Surya important to the farmers of the Hanu and Palghar sub-districts? Well, after India gained independence, uh, Jaipal Singh Munda was sent to Thane district. He was one of the people involved in the making of the constitution. And they were trying to understand what is the condition of tribals in various portions of the country. When he arrived in Thane district, he realized that the Adivasis of this district have been suffering for years. They were pushed into debt slavery. Their ancestral lands were taken away by the landlords, often from various communities, including Parsis, Iranis, upper caste Hindus, Muslims, just about every community you can imagine. And what this meant was that the landowners took away their land by brute force or by trickery. And as a result, Adivasis were pushed into poverty. Munda proposed to the government that we should redistribute the land. Now, we all know that land redistribution policies was the way to go during the early years of independence. But the Reformation policies failed. The reason is political resistance. Landowning classes were not, they were not ready to part away with their land. So when land reformation policies failed, the government decided to go another route, and which was to build dams. So industrialization was being pushed by building more and more dams to ensure that there is alleviation of rural poverty. And that is when, in 1974, Maharashtra proposed Surya Dam so that the Adivasis in this region could be brought out of poverty. This is North Konkan region, and the original inhabitants of this area are the Adivasis. But over 500 years, they were displaced by various rulers, from Portuguese to British to Marathas, and many more. And during British rule, they went a step ahead. And what they did was they reserved forests to protect them against the Adivasis who have occupied this place for hundreds of years. They said, we need to protect these forests from you so that we can save it for ourselves and harvest timber from it, because timber is profit. Which meant that more and more Adivasis lost their lands. By the time of independence, only 10% of this area's land belonged to Adivasis. And even that 10% was poor quality land. It did not grow food that well. And what this meant was that Surya's irrigation facilities would have changed farmers' fate. I know that from my interviews, those villages that get water from Surya are way, way better, more well off as compared to those villages that don't get water from Surya. What is the life cycle of a reallocation? At this point, I would like to emphasize that reallocation is not an event. Rather, it is a process that manifests over the life cycle of the dam. From the stages of original planning, revision of plan, to project execution, and various other stages. For brevity, I will not go over all of these points. But you see that the red marked areas are the areas that are the events that aided reallocation. And you see that they are spread out from 1970s to 2010s, which means it just never stops. I'll explain a few of them. Let me emphasize again, Surya is purely an irrigation project that was reallocated later. The first way of reallocating was after the dam was built in 1981. The water was reallocated for industrial use. And subsequently, between 1981 and 2011, 17 reallocations were made. The other way of reallocating water is through land acquisition. To give you an example, the original farmers of this area were not rehabilitated, not all of them. Only 47 families were rehabilitated. What does that mean? So many of the 345 families never found a land within this water basin, within this command area that benefited from Surya. As a result, The engineers of Surya do not have to keep some quota for the rehabilitated farmers, lesser water to give out for irrigation. Another way of reallocating water is canal construction. Let's look at that deeply. So the government of Maharashtra never completed constructing the canals. 15% of the canals were never constructed, 6% were constructed, but they never connected to the canal network, so they were useless. That amounts to 21% of the canal network that was useless or never connected, or never constructed. Then 24% of the canal network, I think someone's mic is on.
Yeah, Prakriti, your mic is get a little closer. I think voice is fading.
Okay, how much did you miss?
No, we could hear, but it was just little faded.
Okay.
So you can continue.
All right. So 15% of the canal was never constructed. 6% was constructed but never connected to rest of the canal network. So it was useless. That totals up to 21% that is practically useless. And 24% of the canal network, although was constructed, did not receive water. The reason it did not receive water was because most of the water was reallocated. So nothing was left to be given to farmers. So by 2017, 45% of the canal network was curtailed, which means 45% will never get irrigation water. Now think about this. If I make practically 21% of the canal system useless or don't construct it, then a lot of water can never be supplied to farmers. What does that mean? There is more water in the reservoir, which is unused. Then what happens? Cities like Mumbai can find from state records that there is one dam, say Surya, where there is unused water. Then I just need to write an application to the state government saying that, hey, I need more water. And I saw that there is some unused water in Surya Dam. How about if I get that water? How about you reallocate it to me? The process is as simple as that. And I am quoting an engineer from MMRDA. So you can imagine how simple it is that the state first does not construct the canal, shows that the water is unused, and then says, I don't think farmers need it, that's why they're not using it, and now I'm going to redirect the water to urban areas. So another way of understanding how canals fail the farmers is by showing how do canals look. I took this picture by standing on the terrace of the gates of Kavra's pickup pier. And if you notice, this is the canal at the head, and this is cement-lined canal system. In the next picture, you will see that this is a village at the head of the canal where the canal lining has not been maintained for decades. And it's broken, which leads to seepage of water, which means lesser and lesser water reaches mid of the canal and tail of the canal. And while this is bad for irrigation purposes, it's not that black and white. The seepage also recharges drinking wells in the villages, and the seepage recharges the nearby forests. But of course, it does not benefit farmers in terms of irrigation, especially those that are at the mid and tail end of the canal. Another example is a village at the mid of the canal. Here, these villages are slightly above the canal system. So what the original plan did is that the water was brought to a small reservoir and a pipe was constructed that took water from one reservoir to another, from which again small canals provided water to villages. But this pipe broke a decade back and nobody bothered to construct it again to repair it. And that's why you see the well on the other end is dry. So all the villages from this point onwards, from the mid of the canal to the tail of the canal, do not receive water. They haven't received in the last 10 years. And these are the villages that are poorer than those at the head of the canal who receive water. Yet another way of reallocating or aiding the reallocation of water is by expanding the metropolitan region, urbanizing more and more rural areas, including that within the metropolitan area. To give you an example, Vasai Virar and Mira Bhayandar that benefit from Surya's water were themselves rural areas in 1988 when 10,500 hectares of their green protected land was reallocated for urbanization. So the land was converted from rural area to urbanizable area. And as a result, they lost their land, they lost their groundwater. And I will not be surprised that one fine day, the villages around Surya will become part of metropolitan Mumbai and will become urban. In fact, while I was conducting this research in 2019, portions of the Palghar district were included in metropolitan Mumbai, and metropolitan Mumbai became larger than before. The last way of aiding reallocation that I'll discuss is making hundreds of policies. One of the critiques that people working on in this area talk about is the proliferation of policies. There are so many policies that it creates a lot of confusion. And that confusion allows the government to practice reallocation of water in unjust ways. For example, I think it was 2005 when the legislature met at midnight and decided that it will change water policies in Maharashtra. And this was done while a case was going on in the court where farmers of some other dam were fighting against water reallocation. So clearly these practices are unscrupulous. That brings us to the question, why did in metropolitan Mumbai build a new dam in Mumbai hydrometric area? Clearly there are so many dams in the Mumbai hydrometric area. It looks like it's easy for them to build because after all, hydrometric area is demarcated for them. It's named after them. For that, I'll have to tell you a little story, which was part of my research. And that is when Forest Conservation Act was created, that was the year 1980. That is when Surya had already been approved. And post that, Dhamni Reservoir of Surya and the canals of Surya were built, which means that the state government has to comply by Forest Conservation Act of India. That meant that all the forests that they have destroyed by building the dam will have to be rebuilt somewhere else. And also they'll have to pay a hefty fine to the central government for destroying forests, for which the state government owed 96 crores to the central government. So the state government had to pay 96 crores to central government. It did not have that money or didn't want to give that money, whatever may be the reason. So many years later, metropolitan Mumbai, when it realizes that it needs more water, steps in. And it says that, okay, how about I give you 96 crores and you redirect Surya's water to me because Surya's water is not getting used in any case. And well, you know the story, why isn't it getting used? Now, here's the tricky bit. The state of Maharashtra is also the body that runs Mumbai Metropolitan Regional Development Authority, or MMRDA. And MMRDA is the one that is asking, give me water from Surya. And that brings us to the findings. There are two things to note. Metropolitan Mumbai did not want to build a dam in the Mumbai hydrometric area because there are huge costs associated with it. These are not just monetary costs, there are also time-related costs and negotiation costs. Imagine if Metropolitan Mumbai decides to build a new dam. They'll have to go and negotiate contracts with each and every farmer, so hundreds of farmer families. They will have to negotiate with the central government, pay fines for it, build a task force, build an environment impact assessment report. They'll have to do hundreds of things before they can build a dam. So what's simpler? It's simpler to say that that state irrigation dam, that dam called Surya, owned by the state irrigation department, it has some water that farmers are quote unquote not using. So why not just redirect the water to us? The second point is that MMRDA in some cases in the past has been headed by the Chief Minister of Maharashtra. What does that mean? That means that the state government of Maharashtra is both the organization that is creating the rules of this water game, and it is also the organization as MMRDA lobbying for urban water interests. And in all this chaos, there are no strong and rich planning bodies that are representing rural water interests. This unjust act where the state does both, creates the rules and lobbies for one party's interests, is what leads to Mumbai metropolitan area taking away irrigation water from Surya's farmers. I would like to sum up with how do I understand this entire picture? I call it the entrepreneurial state or a business-minded government producing hydrosocial territories. So over so many decades.
Jackie, sorry to interrupt, but it's finished 30 minutes. You can just complete quickly. We've finished 30 minutes.
Okay, yeah. This is the last slide. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. So the entrepreneurial state or the business-minded state have been present in both colonial times and independent times. And both kinds of governments have been business-minded to the extent that they create two sets of policies. One for the urban areas, another for the rural areas. The ones created for urban areas focus on urban expansion and industrialization. They always keep saying that, oh, there's too much population in our cities, and that's why we need to create dam. But the reality is that they first propose expansion, then the population grows, which leads to a need for creation of dams, which in turn leads to more urbanization. Which leads to more urbanization. And that happens because in cities where there is more water present, more industries will move in, more people will move in these urban areas. The second set of policies that entrepreneurial state creates is those for rural areas. Now, these policies focus on weakening of rural rights, weakening of land rights, riparian rights, forest rights. And since the rights of farmers and other rural occupants is weakened, that makes creation of dam and water reallocation an easy task. And then more water is available for urbanization and industrialization. And the more the areas in the state urbanizes, the more state becomes powerful because the metropolitan body is governed by the state. So basically, you weaken rural rights, you make urban areas stronger, and that leads to stronger state. And that is what I call creating or producing hydrosocial territories by entrepreneurial states. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that intriguing and thought-provoking presentation, Prakriti. I'll again request everyone to keep their videos on so that we can have a more interactive conversation. If you have any questions, you can just raise your hands or mention in the chat box that you have a question, and we can unmute you, or you can either type your question in the chat box. So we're going to open up the discussion. I'll start by I just wanted to your presentation practically is extremely interesting and looks at the water reallocation from the perspective um, of the rural and urban linkages. So I wanted to know, how are you going to have you thought of how you're going to be taking this further? Like, have you approached government authorities? Have you put out this research in some way, um, and or probably got some responses from uh, a larger audience apart from the academic audience?
I haven't, because since the time I finished the research, there has been COVID. So I have not been able to return to India, sadly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Uh, but also, the last reallocation was made in 2011. Nothing is going to happen. What I know can be changed is probably when farmers are included in taking these decisions. And that aspect of my research I didn't talk about here, which is more complicated. And that is something called water user association. India's national and state policies talk about water user associations where farmers govern their own water. In this case, the state irrigation department wants farmers to govern their own resources. The tricky bit is farmers are saying that they don't want it unless the state fixes all the broken canals. Because if the management responsibility is passed down to the farmers without fixing the broken canals, then the farmers don't have the resources to repair it. So the solution is to create user associations, but it will be unfair to pass down the management responsibility without repairing the canals.
Right. Hmm. So, I mean, like, is there repair, of course, canals is one of, you know, take something that practice can take back from your research. But
Hmm.
apart from that, would you, um, you know, even when you're looking at urban design in general of metropolitan Mumbai, when it comes to around, let's say, even the Bihar Dam,
Hmm.
would you prescribe, certain aspects into practice which should be kept in mind?
Yeah, thank you for raising that question. So I remember when I was researching this, I went to VVMC, Vasai Virar Municipal Corporation, and I asked them about how many projects have new construction projects, residential projects especially, and maybe even commercial projects, have actually followed on Maharashtra's rule about, or Mumbai's rule about rainwater harvesting and recycling their grey water. And the response that the government official gave me is that this is public data. I can't share it with you. So it was very interesting how the lady defined public data. Public data is not to be shared with public, according to her. It's to be kept with the government officials. And I tried to speak to her boss. I tried to speak to her colleagues, but they didn't budge. And from what I understand from interviews with other people, clearly rainwater harvesting doesn't get practiced in new construction projects. There's a report called Chitle Committee report from 1994, which talked about expanding Mumbai's water resources in various regions, various basins. And in that report, they also talk about various alternatives for urban areas. The problem is all of these alternatives are only on paper. They never get applied. All the adjustment has to be made in the rural side. For example, there are grassroots organizations that work with the farmers of Surya. They went and met the governor of Maharashtra. They met after the farmers had protested for a long time, and the CM and this was during Fadnavis' time. So CM Fadnavis and the governor then met uh, the representatives of farmers. And then the governor made a task force that will decide how can we give the reallocated water to Mumbai without taking away irrigation water from farmers. And one of the solutions they came up with is um, replacing canals with pipes. And that's when the representatives of farmers said that that solution is problematic. The reason being that canals tend to they allow seepage of water in nearby areas, which means that they replenish the drinking water wells of these villages. And if the canals are replaced by pipes, then both the forest and the drinking water wells will dry up. So the representative said that how about at least when you pipe this entire system, you dedicate some water for drinking water in these areas. That still does not solve the problem of forests.
Yeah, it's like, okay, very contradictory. So, do we have any questions? Any questions from the audience? You can just put it in the chat box or let us know. Um,
It can also be comments. I know it's Friday evening. Maybe it's not the best time to have questions and answer sessions here, but you can just comment.
yes, any comments, questions? Yeah, just send.
I wanted to ask if you've come, I mean, in your research, if you've come across a certain project like this, which is actually considered rural right, like rights of farmers and people who live in the rural areas, when they are talking about reallocation of water. Like, I don't know, have you come across a project which has successfully done something like that?
I haven't worked on any, but I'm sure there must be some examples at smaller scale. Maybe
Okay.
not major irrigation projects, but maybe minor irrigation projects.
Okay.
And there are water user associations that have been successful, including in
Okay.
Maharashtra.
Yeah, just taking forward Krishan's question. Um, I mean, like when it comes to, this entire ambiguity between putting up so many policies and, having the citizens and rural folk, affected at large. Do you think, have you come across any such activism um, in the region where you were working? Did you come across any activism related activity which really impacted maybe such policies or brought about any traction?
Yeah. So there's something called Surya Pani Bachao Samiti. And the members of this committee are not necessarily farmers. Some of them are urban dwellers living in Palghar. And they fight for farmers' rights. At the same time, they fight for getting some water for Palghar because some portions of Palghar don't get enough water. So what is interesting is that it is not just an urban versus rural issue. It is about negotiation between people who are disadvantaged in every area. So a disadvantaged crowd in urban area and a disadvantaged crowd in a rural area can actually form a coalition and fight for their rights. And in fact, it was their protest that led to the governor of Maharashtra paying heed to their questions.
We've got
I,
one question.
okay. Yeah.
We've got
No,
one
no,
question
continue.
from Anirudh. Anirudh, do you want to ask your question? You want to unmute and ask, or do you want me to ask? Just read it out. Okay, fine. I'll read it out. So, what he's asking is that Maharashtra has a drought crisis for years now with the dropping water tables. Are there any design changes that you think can propose, that you think you can propose to maybe raise the water table and continue a sustainable supply of water to both rural and urban spaces? This is also keeping in mind the erratic monsoon patterns, your reference to the broken canal system and their passive impact.
I don't think I am the right person to answer this because I have not worked in groundwater yet. And it's much more complicated because um, definitely, well, in my opinion, using groundwater for farming is very dangerous because we don't just have one aquifer. There are three layers of aquifers: shallow, mid, and deep levels. And you can imagine them as river flowing under the ground. And the first level of aquifer moves quite fast. So if you pollute something in one place, let's say you use fertilizers, some chemical that seeped into the ground and then into the first level of aquifer, it will flow and reach nearby regions very quickly within a year, maybe few years. The second level may take a few decades, and the third level that spreads across maybe countries or states may take maybe 100 years. So definitely, I don't think that Using groundwater is a great idea. Having said that, um, the ground reality might be different. Maybe there is no other option, but one has to use it. So I don't have an answer to that. But what I can point out is the irony. The area that I studied is a water-rich region, and still the farmers suffer. And the other problem in that region is that erratic monsoons. When I interviewed the farmers, they said that the weather patterns are odd. They can't predict when the rain will happen. It was more predictable 7, 8 years back, and much lesser now. So what that means is that now they only depend on rain for agriculture. They don't have irrigation. Some villages don't have irrigation, so they can't grow crops in the second season. So they migrate to Vasai Virar and Mira Bhayandar. What an irony. So the place to which you lost your waters is where you become a migrant laborer, seasonal migrant laborer, but still. So yeah, it is more complicated than it seems. And what can be done with the groundwater table, I don't know.
Thanks, Prakriti, for that reply. I think for groundwater table, if you want to know more, Unjust, our next FNC is going to be more related to groundwater tables. So you can definitely catch up on that one. But Krishna, you had a question. You want to say something?
I do not really have a question, but I don't know when the two times that I heard this presentation and we were talking about water reallocation, I kept on drawing a lot of parallels also to the way land is reallocated around cities and how a city, in order to, increase its sprawl if it can, it keeps a lot of land around the city is eventually converted. The original like agricultural land keeps on getting converted into non-agricultural land. And while there are a lot of parallels, one thing is land in itself is it has monetary value because you can sell land and you can get money and you can basically there's a trade of land that happens versus water. At least till now, I don't know of any system in which water in itself is considered as a capital, like sort of something that you can trade for money. So I don't know, like I was just thinking about this, whether are we moving in the same direction for water as a resource also, that eventually we will be trading water also as we trade land.
So remember I talked about many water policies coming up. One of it that Maharashtra proposed actually converts water into a property. So you can make entitlements and you can sell off your water. And it will be treated as a good, a product. And imagine that I, in any case, don't own a land, even though I, as an Adivasi, have been living here for hundreds of years. My forefathers have been living here for hundreds of years. For XYZ reason that I'd explained before, I lost my land. And I have a poor quality of land. So I already have lesser access to so many of the resources that I should have access to. And then imagine someone sells away this land to some city. And I come into this entire water race later. So now not only do I not have access to water, the water that flows next to me is owned by someone else. And that is very common practice in US, in some places of US.
Exactly, that is what I was getting at.
Yeah. So if you read the water policy of Maharashtra, you'll realize that water can now be seen as entitlements. And each entitlement can be sold off. It's a market for water, which is very disturbing. Because the disadvantaged will enter this place later and they will have no control over this. They will not be able to correct the past wrongs. And there was something else that I wanted to say. Can't think of it right now, but I'll come back to it when it strikes me. Is that what you asked, or did you ask something apart from this?
There was no question. It was just like a general observation and something that I was continuously thinking about while looking at your presentation. Like, is this where we are headed? And like you said, a lot of these westernized notions of governance are, we look at these countries and we look at how they're managing their resources and we feel that, okay, so this is the way forward, and then we try to implement it, but then we don't realize that eventually we are just like making this a free market, and then that is always disadvantageous to the vulnerable and to the impoverished, because in the first place they don't have the resources.
Yeah,
So yeah, that was just an observation.
definitely. Yeah.
I think we have
Thanks.
another question.
Yeah, we've got one more question by Nikita. Nikita, do you want to unmute and ask your question, or do you want me to read it out? Okay, I'm going to read it. Um, could you throw light upon the existing national and or state policies of water allocations, and how this metropolitan framework for Mumbai and its hinterland fits within or deviates from this? Is there an efficient usage of dams or of dam water right now?
Yeah. So national policy and state policy both follow a similar pattern, which is mm, drinking water is most important, then is irrigation water, and then is industrial water. So there's some sort of priority. Um, at some point, Maharashtra changed the order, made domestic water the most important, and then industrial water. So irrigation was pushed to the bottom. Then farmers and grassroots organizations protested, and the order was reversed again. But what message that change had sent out to public is that those those uses of water that are economically more efficient are more important to us. Irrigation is not as important because it does not get as much money. So water is money, right? A city that does not have enough and regular, reliable water supply may not have many people entering that city. You won't see companies moving there if there's constantly a water shortage. You won't see industries moving there. So what the state was doing was sending out a message that urban domestic water and industrial water are most important. Anyhow, it was reversed back. So in that sense, India and the state policies are similar. There is a report by Mihir Shah from 2016, which has some progressive uh, ideas about how water should be managed, how this entire process can be more equitous. And there is some critique, while this report was appreciated, it has also been critiqued, saying that how much of it actually gets converted on ground. These policies are made, these solutions are proposed, but they don't get implemented on ground. But I would recommend you reading that. I would not go into detail, but please do read Mihir Shah's report.
Okay, so I think that's about it. We don't have any more questions. Do you want to like Prakriti just share? Okay, so there's a comment by Nikita, right? I think there's this contesting of for irrigation to be the first priority, even with the use of wastewater. The equity of it is always an imbalance. Thanks for the references.
Thank you for the questions. I enjoyed this conversation. I thank you for all the questions and for this opportunity to present my research. It's always good to share it. And if there is any feedback on the research, I would love to take it so that
Yeah.
when I meet people again, I can work on it.
Thank you so much, Prakriti, for being a part of the Friday night conversation. It was lovely to have you. And yeah, we're very interested to know how this goes forward uh, as you do your PhD and then eventually practice.
I'll keep you in the loop.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining
Thank
today,
you.
and hope to see you again after next to next Friday. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, Prakriti, for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.